Okay, so does this sound like you? You love NPR's podcasts, you wish you could get more of all your favorite shows, and you want to support NPR's mission to create a more informed public. If all that sounds appealing, then it is time to sign up for the NPR Plus bundle. Learn more at plus.npr.org.
Heads up, the segment contains some salty language. Hey everyone, you're listening to Code Switch, the show about race and identity from NPR. I'm B.A. Parker, and today I've got longtime friend and NPR producer Skyler Swinson joining me on the mic. Hey Skyler.
Hi Parker.
All right, so Skyler, what brings you to Code Switch?
Okay, I want to start by playing a TikTok video. It's a video where this comedian is impersonating essentially a white person in an Asian restaurant, if Asians acted like white people in an Asian restaurant. And for context, because you can't see it, she is biracial, half Korean, half white.
Okay, simple enough. Okay, let me look.
There's so many white people in here. This is like legit. Oh my god, the menu is only in English. Legit. Yes, can I get the pancakes? Okay, so the reason why I ordered pancakes is because it's morning, and in morning time, white people only eat pancakes. It's like disrespectful to order anything else. It's like a traditional breakfast, and so for me ordering pancakes, I'm showing the server that I respect their culture and I understand.
I have never seen this person on my TikTok ever.
Maybe this is like very niche, like Asian American TikTok algorithm content only, but
I've never seen her, but this is funny.
So I found Youngmi for the first time on TikTok, and it was this video, and it reminded me of, do you remember that blog from back in the day called Stuff White People Like?
Yes.
Okay, like that was a pivotal moment in my life where I realized that like whiteness was a thing, and I began to question my own relationship with it as someone who is racially Asian, but raised by white people, right, as an adopted Korean. Mm-hmm. And Youngmi, while not an adoptee, is biracial, and her comedy just struck me as like a very sharp deconstruction of both worlds that she inhabits in a way that I instantly related to as a transracial adoptee. She has a memoir that just came out a few months ago. It's called I'm Laughing Because I'm Crying, and it is very reflective of her humor and her style and her understanding of both Korean culture, but in this kind of like American context. And so I thought that her comedy and the things that she raises about identity would be perfect for a show like Code Switch.
Love that. All right, Skyler, you're going to get into it when we come back.
I sure am.
This message comes from Wise, the app for doing things in other currencies. Sending or spending money abroad? Hidden fees may be taking a cut. With Wise, you can convert between up to 40 currencies at the mid-market exchange rate. Visit wise.com. T&Cs apply.
Donald Trump promised to change Washington, D.C., a place where there's an old saying that personnel is policy. That's why we have created a new podcast called Trump's Terms, where you can follow NPR's coverage of the incoming Trump administration, from his cabinet secretaries to political advisors and top military leaders, to understand who they are, what they believe, and how they'll govern. Listen to Trump's Terms from NPR.
Growing up as one of just a handful of Asian kids in Denver, Colorado, I learned pretty quickly that in order to not be invisible or made fun of by my peers, I had to be funny. If I could riff and make people laugh, everyone would think I was cool instead of the weird, quiet Asian girl who was very obviously not raised by her quote-unquote real parents. So I memorized one-liners from The Simpsons every day after school. I stayed up late to watch Norm Macdonald on SNL every weekend. And although I didn't grow up to be a stand-up comic, I learned to value humor as an escape, as relief, as a means of survival through the hard times. I guess I have a somewhat dark sense of humor. To quote the late 90s Canadian rock band Bare Naked Ladies, I'm the kind of guy who laughs at a funeral. And I've always thought of my sense of humor as a byproduct of trauma, the trauma I experienced as a transracial adoptee. Comedy certainly wasn't something I ever thought to connect with my own Korean heritage. In fact, I remember my mom telling me once that she didn't think Korean culture valued humor in the same way that Americans do.
It's probably because the Koreans that they interacted with are put in a place that it's not safe to laugh and joke around.
This is Korean comic Youngmi Mayer.
The immigrant Korean person that's working at the laundromat, like the one Korean family, in Denver, is not going to find a lot of humor in there.
She's actually half Korean, half white American, and spent a lot of her childhood in Korea before moving to the U.S. in her early 20s.
Working in restaurants for so long, even if you're not Korean, when you're a server and you're a customer, like when you go take the plate, it's empty and they're like, I hated it. And you have to be like, like you're like put in the service position.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm assuming most Korean people that other Americans knew or that they interacted with were their, like nail techs or their laundromat person or their restaurant server. And they just felt like oppressed. It's like they can't act freely. I'm sure they were being funny to each other.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's this other part of it where I've seen so many white comedians, American comedians, tell me that they think Korean humor or comedy is really stupid. I've heard multiple times them accuse Koreans of ripping off vaudeville. And the Korean comedic tradition comes from ancient theater. There is like this very big theme of making fun of the rich man that's stupid, which is really interesting because that's basically The Office, like Michael Scott. Like that's the biggest theme in like Korean culture. Like, and then that character would get on stage with like white face paint because they're not in the sun, so they're white and they're really stupid and we all laugh at them. And there's all these other like very ancient tropes in Korean theater. But then as soon as an American person sees it on TV, which has now, come into modern time on TV, like variety shows, their only cultural like reference is vaudeville, or they think that's what it looks like. So they're like, wow, Koreans are copying American old-timey comedy. And it's like, no, that existed thousands of years before America was a country.
Youngmi is a comedian and writer who rose to social media fame for mocking casual racism white people seem to get away with in everyday life. But she also dishes out brutal critiques of Korean culture, too. Something about her humor and satire stood out to me as deeply clarifying and immediately relatable. It's true that we're both she-theys who live in New York City, dye our hair, and share an unfortunate history of dating men who skateboard. But what's drawn me the most to her comedy is her awareness of her own dark sense of humor as a deeply Korean thing. In her new memoir called I'm Laughing Because I'm Crying, she writes about humor as a tool of survival for the Korean women in her family, from her grandmother to her present-day self. She captures a realness and acceptance of mess and contradiction in a way that feels distinctly Korean.
So I'm Laughing Because I'm Crying is based on this saying, a Korean saying that I'm very fond of. The saying is, if you laugh while crying, hair grows out of your butthole. And it's just something that my mom used to say when she would punish me. I know I can say butthole on here. I don't know if I can say beat my ass. But like when she used to beat my ass and I would cry. And so that's like basically where a big theme of my work comes from. Like this idea that the saddest, shittiest stuff is what makes us laugh the hardest. He had lived his entire life trying to convince my grandmother that he was worthy of her love, and in the 9 days he lay dying, all she did was roast him for being stupid and lazy. After he died, my grandmother wailed for days. She said she wasn't sad that he died, she was sad that all the money was gone, and she no longer had a husband to make more money. In the middle of her crying, she joked about how she knew he had killed himself because he was lazy and wanted to get out of work. Maybe my grandmother might seem cruel to some, but this was how Koreans were taught to show love in times of genocide. You don't show anyone what you love, because if you do, they will take it away from you. My grandmother constantly complained about her life and her husband, but she always made it funny. People always listened to her complaints because she disguised them as jokes. That in itself is a talent created out of survival, an invisible talent. My family was thrown into poverty and ruin in the years following my grandfather's suicide, but they all survived. I want to say it's because of the jokes. But all of the Korean people from this era were like this, full of humor and self-deprecation. And a lot of them died. They died while laughing. Even in their final moments, they would comfort one another by telling them how funny it all was. My Korean family is poor and uneducated. They are ashamed of it and continually try to hide their shame with endless jokes. At funerals, we laugh. As an adult, I have had to curb my humor in social situations because other people have told me it's inappropriate. I don't know how to explain to them that I come from the strongest people who have been through the worst of humanity, and the jokes were what made it possible for us to continue. I would not be here without inappropriate humor.
So can you tell me a little bit about your grandmother's life story? You describe her as the niche micro-celebrity of her time. And what can you tell us about like the details of her life that led her to find comedy?
So my grandmother and my mother have very interesting lives compared to the women in Korea at the time. My grandmother was born into a wealthy family as the oldest daughter with no sons. And because of that, I mean, they were relatively wealthy. Like, this is like farmland, Korea, 1912 or something. But they were relatively wealthy. And so her dad, like, sent her to middle school. And she learned how to read. And she was really into poetry. And she was very good at it. So she was sent around to perform, you know, these, like, old Korean poetry readings, which sounds so boring. I don't know. They really had no entertainment back then, if that's what they're lining up to see. But so she would go around and perform, you know, like for wealthy family events or whatever. I don't know. I'm assuming. And that was her dream, to become like a poet and a performer. And there's lots of old school, like Korean performance arts that involve, you know, like a woman reciting poems. They really love that. Like with like a drum in the background. And so that was her dream. And she was also, for the record, not attractive. And her parents were really stressed out because of that. Like, she would be hard to marry, which I don't even know if that's that important. That was my mom's theory. But anyway, because of that, those reasons, I guess, she, instead of marrying somebody in her class, ended up being married off to like an indentured servant who was my grandfather on her father's farm.
Did you spend time with her grandma?
No, she died when I was 2. So I never really, I have these like very old memories of her, which is surprising because I was 2 when she passed. But I still remember like going to her house and stuff. Mm-hmm. But I never had like a conversation with her.
I was thinking a lot about that, especially in this chapter about your grandmother. How were you able to get details about her life, and what was the experience like researching for the book?
So everything that I know about my family, my Korean family, is directly from my mom. Right when I started writing this, I went to Korea and then I recorded her. And basically, I just asked her about these stories she would tell me when I was growing up. So then I just recorded her telling me these stories about, you know, my grandma and her life. And then I guess because I didn't really know that much about Korean history, like I didn't learn about it. I only heard the stories through my mom's family. So when my mom was like, you know, my oldest brother was born like 26 years or something before I was born. He died before I was born because he was killed by the Japanese. And like she just said that as a sentence. And then later on, like learning the history of Korea, and then I'm like, oh my God, that like happened to like my family. You know, it's like, whoa, like that's so weird. My mom like remembers my grandpa dying, you know, like killing himself as a direct result of that. And I was like, oh, like they like lived through this historical stuff. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting learning the history, you know, like on paper, like by reading about it after hearing about it, you know, through my family. The one thing I really enjoy
is going to my mom's neighborhood because she lives in the neighborhood that she grew up in this very rural part of Korea. And like the old Korean ladies will come up and talk to us, and they all talk like her, you know, like Korean country women are so fucking raw. They're just like, fuck you, like, you dumb bitch. Like, they all talk like that. You dirty dog bitch. And just like, whoa, like right off the gate. And so I'm like, oh, for me, I always felt my whole life like I'm not a Korean traditional woman. Like, I'm not soft and demure or whatever. But then I'm like, oh, that's not even true. Like, Korean women are like rough and like knee slappy, you know, and they're like eating like a corn out of a sweaty plastic bag, like kneeling in the corner of the bus station, like flipping you off. They're
squatting, spitting. Absolutely. I deeply relate with the Ajuma kind of grit. And I just have to say, like, it's really moving to me to hear you talk about Korea and the country, because that is where I was born. And I have been in reunion with my Korean family for about 10 years, but because of the language barrier, like, I don't have access to ask them stories about our ancestors or even past generations. And so when I read your book and when I hear you talk about it, it kind of feels like I can picture that for myself for like the first time. A part that stood out to me in the beginning of your book is when you're talking about researching your family and discovering that you're actually like a clone of your recent ancestors. And you write, people say that the dead live on in the memories of their loved ones, but they're actually fully alive in us. And, you know, I think about the bumper sticker or t-shirt that's like, I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams. And this quote is like, nope, they're here right now in this room. They're like breathing, living within us, and we act out or act in certain ways that are kind of like channeling them. And I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit more about that idea and like if you feel that comes up for you now.
Yeah, it's like this idea that, I mean, this is another part about being like from two cultures, which I think everyone can understand. Being biracial and being brought up in two cultures, having to always think about how people see stuff and compare the two. Like in the West, there's this idea that you're an individual, right? And you special, and like everything you've done, you did. And obviously in the East, like people talk about this to death. I hate this, but like you're a collective and you're part of the stuff, and you didn't do anything. Like you're just part of us, you know. And like it's not like the selfish thing. And I think I've always toggled between those two ideas growing up. And I think there is this like, oh, I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams. In that phrase, there's this thing like, oh, look at me. I'm so privileged. Like I got all the fruit of their labor. But in, I guess, like the more Korean way to see it is like, I am them and they are me. So I'm getting what I did and we're the same or something. Do you know what I mean? It's like separating yourself from who you are that I dislike. I don't know.
Yeah, like it's like comforting to not think of us as separate from ancestors before us, but rather like we're all kind of in this collective together.
Yeah, I guess it's like, you know, like that phrase, like I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams, is really sad, right? Because it's like we think about our grandma, like my grandma, like lived and died the shitty life, couldn't do what she wanted. But then the reality is like, if I look at my personality, it's literally my grandma. And in a weird way, it is like her living again. And in this instance, she got to do it, you know? And it's like two things. It's like it alleviates the sadness, and it also alleviates this like sort of self-absorbed, like I'm the princess like feeling, you know? It's like we all did this together and we're always like together.
Yeah. When we come back, how healing from trauma for Youngmi has led to a different kind of comedy for her kid.
It's like he will find humor in stuff that's just very wholesome. Like his Halloween costume was like, I want to be a spicy chicken nugget. And when people are like, why are you spicy? I'm going to be like, because I'm packing heat. And I'm going to open the sauce packet and there's going to be a gun in there. And I was like,
That's coming up. Stay with us. You're listening to Code Switch from NPR. Skyler, just Skyler, Code Switch. I've been talking with comedian Youngmi Mayer about her memoir, I'm Laughing Because I'm Crying, and how comedy and humor go hand in hand with tragedy and trauma. We connected over how our humor is shaped by and also shapes our relationship with Korea. One of the things that drew me to your comedy was how you talk about Korea and our relationships to Korea as like, you know, the yin and yang, like the both extreme feelings at the same time, right? To love Korea is to like hate it, actually, or like to love it.
Oh, yeah.
It's a love-hate thing, but it's like not just, I don't know. I have a hard time talking about this. Like, it's not two things. It's like the same thing at once.
Yeah.
And to like, yeah, feel connected to Korea often involves like a feeling of being rejected by it, or at least that's kind of how I feel. It's like, I feel this connection to this place that is actually rooted in my separation from it, you know?
Yeah.
I felt this really strongly in the passage about meeting your former husband, Danny Bowen, in the book, who is also a Korean adoptee and a super successful chef, which you talk about. And I wanted to read this part that stood out to me. You say, as a Korean, when meeting a Korean adoptee, I feel a negative charge. It feels like rubbing the wrong parts of two batteries together. A painful repelling that is supposed to be an attraction. Korean adoptees have told me time and time again that they feel abandoned and neglected. But what they do not know is that Koreans also feel a longing for them. The longing for the lost child, the lost sibling. Like when people look at the Taeguk and see the dividing line and ignore the fact that a circle binds them together. A big reason I married Danny was because I needed to show him that we all missed him. I needed to accept him with the open arms denied me so many times by Koreans. Yeah. I like read that line about wanting to show him that we all missed him, and I like started sobbing, like big sobs, and like dropped your book on the ground of my apartment and was just like, woo. Just the thought that we as adopted Koreans could be like missed by other Korean people was like really profound and beautiful. And yeah, thank you for writing that. And yeah. Okay, my question. Okay, now we have to laugh now. Okay, because we're
Where's the shared tissue, Skylar? Give us the one tissue that we're sharing, please. Don't use more than one. Okay. It's wartime.
This is wartime. Oh my God. Yeah. I think I always thought that the ability to hold multiple truths at once, or things that seem opposite from one another, was just like a Korean adoptee thing. Mm. Yeah, I think as adopted people, we have to hold multiple truths at once because, like, it's just always that. Like, I think, in particular, like as I've grown older, I've become more aware of and critical of systems of adoption. And thank you for writing about adoption in your memoir with nuance and not the kind of like fairy tale trope that I think we're used to hearing, right? Yeah. That like you should feel grateful as an adoptee, you know, like aren't you so lucky that you got to like have all these nice things and like and what is so quickly erased is like the loss, right?
Yeah.
I guess when I read this passage about Danny and like what it felt like to be around adoptees, I was like kind of nervous, like, oh shit, like does Youngmi know I'm an adoptee and I'm gonna be like interviewing her and like putting her on the spot emotionally a little bit, or like I don't know, I guess I wanted to just ask you what it's like, because I think that I know a lot of other Korean adopted people find your humor like really clarifying and relatable. And yeah, I guess I'm just curious, since your relationship with Danny and, just knowing other adopted people, I assume, like throughout your life here in the States, if you could just talk about like what feels kind of like painfully repelling about being in community with or knowing other adopted people.
So I will say this, we are basically the same group of people, right? If you think about it, in many ways. We are the result of all the fucking war and like, BS that happened. And we exist because of that. We would not exist without that, right? And I write about like, how the adoption industry started in Korea. It was a way to get rid of biracial children because we were stateless. And I just want to mention really quick before I get into boo-hoo, Koreans are the victims. Koreans are now doing this abroad in like Southeast Asia. And I want to note that. And it ties into like this whole idea of like everything being connected, like we are, now there's like Korean sex tourists in Southeast Asia, using sex workers, having children, abandoning them there who are stateless. And, you hear about a lot of East Asian people doing that in other parts of the world. So it's like, before I say boo-hoo Koreans, which I know we are probably like mostly the victims of this, I just want to note that, it's interesting that we always have to live on this like both sides of the equation place, right? Not just Koreans, but everybody. That having been said, I think it was not until I was like in my 20s or 30s that I realized that I am like basically the same kind of person as an adoptee, right? Like I am rejected by my society. I was created, obviously against my will, like we all are, but then and put in the situation that was the bottom rung of what I could be. And I think this is a complicated thing to talk about in America, not in Korea, because Korean people understand that a biracial person and an adoptee are similar. They're like the garbage of what happened because of the war, like, and they feel kind of bad for us. But in America, they're like, "Oh, are you like from Hong Kong and your dad's a British businessman or something?" Like, and they're like, "What are you complaining about? What are you, a model? You're gonna take all the acting roles, Henry Golding?" Like they have that vision of like a half-white Asian person being better than other Asian people. But in Korea, it's like seen like not good, right? And so I think it wasn't until my adult years that I realized I'm like the same kind of person. And in this weird way, I think I was drawn to Danny, but, having other friends that are adoptees, and I really understand them because that's like what's happening in my mind constantly, like being rejected. And it's like this... what's the word? What's that phrase? The cognitive dissonance of being like, no, I'm the victim, but why are you acting like I did something bad? It's like that kind of feeling, like I should be happy, but then I was hurt. It's like that sort of feeling. And then I think the reason why the negative attraction thing, I would say it's more like Koreans are like how they respond to feeling guilty is being like, oh, like I don't want to see that. That's so embarrassing. But for me, I'm kind of like, I think there is this connection that I have with adoptees where they are way like ethnically more Korean than me because they're 100% Korean, but they don't know anything about Korea. And I know everything about Korea and I grew up there. But then Koreans are like, you're not Korean. And so it's like we have like balanced each other out in this way, So I think that's like a connection that I have. But I think it was really important for me to talk about that. Not just for Korean adoptees or biracial people, but Korean Americans who also feel rejected when they go back and they don't speak Korean and they don't know how to fucking use chopsticks. So who cares? They're always like, oh, I hate going to Korea because then they make me feel like shit about not being good enough. First of all, we shouldn't be fighting for their whatever validation. They should be fighting for our validation and our approval. They did us dirty. So it's flipped. And then second of all, literally nobody is Korean enough for Koreans, like they just give up. Like it's not going to happen. And like that feeling, because I hear a lot of adoptees go back to Korea and they're like, oh, they don't accept me because I don't know about this or that. And I'm like, they don't accept my 90-pound Korean cousin that went to like Ewha Women's University and she is a doctor. They don't accept her. They say that she's too fat.
Right.
So
right.
what are we gonna do? Nothing. We're not even in the race. Like we should give up. And so the culture of Korea is all about you're not good enough. We're always gonna reject you. So it's like, you know, it's interesting to me when I hear about like a Korean adoptee going there and they're like, oh, like, you know, they could tell I have an accent, so they treat me bad. I'm like, no, they just treat everyone bad. Like,
We're not special.
yeah, I'm sorry to break it to you. Like, I don't have an accent, and they still are like, ew.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess like to answer like your question, it was like important for me to mention that, and it's very important for me. I think one of the things that I always want to talk about is like this whole like Korea is not going to accept you, you know, maybe because you're biracial or adopted or you're the child of immigrants and you're expat, whatever, you grew up outside of there. All those ideas are wrong, and don't make them like say that to you, you know? I feel like I'm like the old Korean grandma in the rice paddy, like, don't let them talk to you like that. Come here. Yeah. I'm going to cut you some Asian pear, or a pear as I call it. You know?
Do you feel like writing this book brought you closer to Korea? And is that even something that you want? It sounds like maybe not. But like, I don't know, just like having to sit with and think about and write about like this history and your identity and researching it and acknowledging the like kind of complicated duality of it. Like, do you feel a closeness with Korea?
I don't think I can feel close or far from Korea. It's just unfortunately like who I am. Unfortunately and very fortunately, it's just like who I am. And I think, you know, it's who you are, right? Like it's like it's this what's that called? Fear of not being your identity. That's like totally not true. You just are that. Like there's nothing you can do to not be that. You can't run away from it, and you can't not be it ever. You know what I mean? You can't be more of it. It's just what it is. I think writing this book, I don't think I have any shift in my feelings of Korea. I hate it and I love it, you know? Like it's just who I am. I'm happy that I'm Korean. I'm happy that I'm biracial because I love being angry. And and I think, you know, like...
Which is very Korean.
It is. I mean, you know, it's a stereotype, but, you know, we've all seen what the inside of a K-barbecue restaurant looks like at 1 a.m. So, I don't know. I think it's just like this acceptance of what it is, right? Which is also the theme of the book. Like, there's nothing to be sad about. There's nothing to be happy about. It's just that. Yeah.
Speaking of things that are very Korean of you, I noticed that you dedicated the book to your mom and dad.
I'm freaking out. Oh my God. I can't even talk about
I think
this.
it says like to mom and dad and then in parentheses, please don't hate me.
Oh, God.
And
I'm so stressed out.
How did you arrive at deciding to dedicate your book to your parents?
Well, this is the thing. I think in writing the book, I just wrote it in my voice and with my emotions, right? And a lot of people are like, oh, this is really like bad about your parents. And I'm like, is it bad? I don't know if it's bad. It's just my experience. And I don't think it's just like all these bad things that they did. For me, it just feels like this is what they did, good and bad. And that's how I thought it came across. But I like really love my parents, and they're very amazing people. And, you know, like we talked about earlier, I am my parents. Like that's just who I am. Like there's so much of me that's their personality that I'm just borrowing while I'm here, essentially, you know? And everything that I hate that I see in them, I see in myself. And I know a lot of people fear that. Like people are always like, I don't want to become my parents. Just like, you know, like I'm not Korean enough, like all these like things. It's like, yeah, that's just what you are, you know, unfortunately. But obviously that's not an absolute truth. Like if my parents were very negligent when I was a kid, and now I would never do some of the things that they did to my son, obviously. And it's part of our responsibility, I think, as people to not repeat the harmful things that our parents did to us. But, in a lot of ways, I'm just like my parents, like, and there's no, like, running from that. And I feel like it's almost like thanking them or dedicating it to them as being like, this is, like, you, in a weird way. This is like, you did this.
Well, for people who follow you on social media, know your son, Mino, who is a budding poet and comedian in his own right. And we've talked about, and you write about, like, your decision to end certain cycles of violence and abuse and creating a better future for your son and being better than our parents, like, as a parent, or trying to, right? So I guess I'm wondering, like, if humor and comedy kind of go hand in hand with tragedy and trauma, what kind of comedic legacy do you want your son, Mino, to inherit?
Well, I don't want him to inherit the trauma part, so I don't know where.
Like, how is he going to be funny then?
Yeah, I'm going to slap him around. Just kidding. Well, what I noticed about Mino is that he's already very funny, and it's interesting because he is so easy to laugh. Like, he laughs very genuinely, like, deeply laughs at, like, everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that about him. And it's just like, I mean, I think most babies do this, but there's this weird phenomenon where babies, if you rip a piece of paper in front of them, they start laughing, like, uncontrollably. Like, they can't, like, they shit their pants, literally. They're, like, just ripping a piece of tape or paper, and people don't know why. But ever since then, he's been stuck in that mode, I feel like, where I will just, like, it's so easy. Like, I'll, like, get a bedtime book, and, like, right before I read it, I'll just draw butts on the characters, and then, like in the middle of it, and I'll be like, and then we're reading a part, and I'm like, oh my God, look at his butt. And then he'll just, like, start, like, crying, laughing. And it's, like, really interesting. And when I saw his, like, lighthearted personality, I was like, oh, I'm sure that was something that I had a hand in creating, like, his lightheartedness and finding humor in a lot of things. Even though I think a lot of children have, like, inherent personalities, for sure. And I think that is something that I'm missing, that I can see is very different in him, that I'm, like, really happy that he has sort of continued this legacy of being a humorous person and a funny person, but in this way that's, like, completely different than me. It's like, I don't know how to explain it. It's like he will find humor in stuff that's just very wholesome. And I can't find a better word. I feel like that's making it sound not funny. But it's, like, legitimately funny.
Like, pure comedy gold.
Yeah.
That's not deflecting something sad.
It's, like, absurd. It kind of reminds me of, like, this might be a kind of a weird reach in, like, comedy theory, but it does remind me of how, like, white people humor gets to progress and become, like, absurdist and avant-garde. So then you have, like, Tim and Eric, which is like pineapple or whatever, and you're like, this is really funny, but, like, where is this coming from? It's not because your mom beat you, like, my humor. And I feel like Mino's humor is like that. Like, his Halloween costume was like, I want to be a spicy chicken nugget. And I was like, okay. And he's like, but I have to have a gun. And I was like, why? And he's like, because I'm going to have a sauce packet. And when people are like, why are you spicy? I'm going to be like, because I'm packing heat. And I'm going to open the sauce packet and there's going to be a gun in there. And I was like, that is so weird, but so funny. Like, he said it way more funnier than I did. And I was, like, laughing so hard. I was like, you're going to be a chicken nugget with a gun. Like, that's so funny. And he was, like, laughing, telling me, because he was like, no, this is so funny. Isn't that funny? And I was like, yes, but I don't know how to explain why.
Oh, my God. Chicken nugget with a gun is truly our ancestors' wildest dreams.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's our show. You can follow us on Instagram at NPR Code Switch. If email is more your thing, ours is codeswitch@npr.org. And subscribe to the podcast on the NPR app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Code Switch newsletter by going to npr.org/codeswitch newsletter.
And just a reminder that signing up for Code Switch Plus is a great way to support our show and public media, and you'll get to listen to every episode sponsor-free. So please go find out more at plus.npr.org/codeswitch.
This episode was produced by Skyler Swinson and Xavier Lopez. It was edited by Dahlia Mortada. Our engineer was James Willits.
And a big shout out to the rest of the Code Switch massive: Christina Kala, Jess Kung, Leah Danella, Courtney Stein, Jasmine Romero, Verilyn Williams, and Jean Demby.
I'm B.A. Parker.
I'm Skyler Swinson.
Hydrate.
Take a nap.